Hello and welcome again to Nerd Variety. I'm Hunter, your host for this day. This is my topic, and I'm joined by the lovely Hannah.
I swore for a second you were going to say Josh.
Well, I mean, Josh is lovely too.
Oh, thank you.
And Josh, don't hear you.
Yeah, yes, I'm here.
Yeah.
If you think I'm lovely, that's on you.
Yeah. Apparently, Hannah doesn't think you're lovely, or maybe she does.
I mean, everybody
It was
has.
hard
No,
to
I
tell
just
from
thought
that,
you were going to
avert expectations.
Yeah, avert expectation. Be the lovely Josh, and I'm just over here like, hey.
No, I mean, that's fine. Nobody says I'm lovely, but I get that. All right, today we are talking about military fiction. I don't know if that's exactly the right term for what I want to discuss, or if there's a better one.
Bravo, Oscar, Mike.
Okay. You just saying boom?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, so, you know what? I actually had kind of an introduction written, or actually a good plan, but I actually don't know right now just the best way to move over to this. So, how familiar are you two with military fiction?
Depends.
An Apache helicopter has guns and missiles.
That seems more factual than fiction. More factual.
Well, I think we all have. Well, you and me probably have some decorated experience when it comes to military fiction.
I think honestly, excuse me. I think the first question we need to ask is, what is military fiction? Because we talked about this a little bit ahead of time, but like there's kind of a lot of different things it can be perceived as.
Mm-hmm.
So, is it?
Josh has a burning question.
Is it military? Like, is it historical military fiction, or is it like just any kind of fiction that has a military in it, or is like focused around a military? Like, kind of, what are we defining it as?
So, to me, when I was thinking of this topic before, it was. I'm going to try to say this as clear as possible. I don't always do that very well. So I would say it's like anything. It's generally more grounded in reality, but still fiction, and usually having to do with some kind of, I guess, warring factions. Generally based in like military or like ground combat. So a lot of times for me, I think of, and maybe not always, maybe there is some espionage, but it's usually governments fighting each other. So for me, like one question I had here, or one note I had was like, what are some of the biggest names in military fiction? And this may help you understand what it is or what your own take is on it. So for me, just to start off, I think when I think military fiction, my first thought is, or the first person I think of is Tom Clancy.
That's a well-rounded answer when it comes to military fiction.
Yeah. So, what do you guys have any other points on that, or any other interpretations of what it is?
So we're not just talking about a story where the main character is from the military, but more like the whole premise revolves around the military rather than just like, oh yes, I'm a whatever, like military person. I don't know how I'm saying this well, but it's less about like the characters being part of the military, more about like the whole thing being military. Does that make sense?
That's kind of what I am thinking.
If you have like a majority of characters that have a military role, and it's a military driven, it's kind of more of a combat driven story.
Okay, because I think about you mentioned in our little pre-bit Halo, right, which is
I would definitely consider that military fiction, sci-fi / military fiction, but
right. And so I think
we'll get into that.
Yeah, and so I think of Stargate, and because Stargate is for some reason not as well known as like Star Trek, It's really good. Came out in the 90s. But it's very similar in terms of like there's these people and they're explorers, and they go to a bunch of different planets. But when they're not exploring, they're at a military base and they are like military people, and there's definitely like some, I guess you could even say it, like military politics going on. Is like you have to listen to this guy even though you disagree with him because he's a higher rank, and so like there's definitely elements of that are kind of wrapped up in this sci-fi show.
Yeah.
So
yeah, again, I've heard a lot about Stargate. Never seen it.
So good. It's on Amazon Prime.
Kind of same with Star Trek. Although I've seen a little bit of Star Trek, I hear a lot about it, but I don't really know much about it. Well, no, not mostly from you at all. My dad was a big Star Trek fan, so I heard a lot about it from him. Same with Battlestar Galactica. Those three I kind of think of in the same breath, or Stargate, Battlestar Galactica, and Star Trek.
I don't know much about Battlestar Galactica, but I am with a name like Battlestar Galactica. I imagine it has a more militaristic sort of way of doing things. And I would say Star Trek is kind of the outlier there because they really are like force only when necessary kind of people. Like they're primarily explorers, where in Stargate they were attacked by these creatures and their main goal is to explore, to find them and destroy them.
Yeah.
Because they're evil and they're killing people. So
the whole thing is a seek and destroy mission.
Kind of, yeah, but they have to search thousands of planets because they don't know how to get to their planet, basically. So it's more focused on fighting, I guess.
So it sounds like your experience in the genre is more when it's mixed with like science fiction.
Does that surprise you?
No, I mean I'm just,
no, pretty much, sci-fi, military. I mean, I guess you could say it would be interesting to talk about my other sort of favorite genre is fantasy. So like we haven't really talked about fantasy military because like that could be a thing.
That's later on the agenda.
Is that on the docket? Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
So that's Hannah's take. Josh, what's your take on the genre?
My biggest take, or my few takes on from military fiction, we're just watching certain movies like historical reenactments. My dad was a Air Force technician, so he watched a lot of movies with him growing up. More of a my own military, like delve into military fiction comes from playing video games, Call of Duty, of course, because you are set in a war, a fictionalized version of the war, to where you are having to do a bunch of military things. You learn, you get a little taste of some kind of military like experience. No, I wouldn't say experience. you get to play. You get to have a little.
Should we say exposure?
Exposure, yeah, that's better. Yeah, exposure of like, okay, this is how the military works, so to speak, and have fun. Shooting all their guns and having fun with the jargon, and going on those and fighting in war. And then of course in like more recent movies, military are kind of like a side, like, or like kind of like a side portion of the movie. Like military comes in and then you have the boots on the ground. They're all serious and all take charge, and they can either make the situation worse or make the situation better. And of course there's like certain directors that love to have military in the movies, like Michael Bay, and I'm trying to think of some other ones. I know Michael Bay likes military in his movies.
Francis Ford Coppola.
Question about definitions. Would you include like? So I'm thinking about the Resident Evil remakes that are like there's not really military, but they revolve around police officers and like a small sort of private military, I guess you could say it.
Yeah.
Would you count that?
I wouldn't
really,
but I mean, I've played. I don't know how much I've played of Resident Evil 2, the Resident Evil 2 remake. I've played some of it. I think I just got out of the precinct. I don't think I'm too far in, but so based on that, and I played like Resident Evil 7 and 5, so.
But you would say that like
I
police fiction is different from military, or different enough that you would put them in different genres.
maybe, or
different genres.
maybe kind of a subgenre almost.
Maybe
Again,
like
with my experience, I wouldn't consider it that.
Because definitely, like, there's the
fiction,
realm
but-
of stuff that's like buddy cop or like the NCIS, CSI kind of
Mhm.
stuff, which I would definitely say is different. But
Yeah.
in terms of like the Resident Evil games, where I feel like they play very similarly to something like Call of Duty, like they don't have to, but it is a similar sort of style.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean,
because you can take that.
that seems like a really big stretch because in
Is
Call
it?
of Duty, like you're
Mhm.
usually with a squad.
There is
from
that,
what I know,
yeah.
and
Yeah.
it's a little more active. Like you're going in specifically just to shoot and kill everybody. Whereas Resident Evil, you're going around, you're solving a lot of puzzles, you're trying to do
That's true.
specific things, and
Yeah, you're kind of your own character in that regard. In like Resident Evil, that character may have had some military past or whatever, some ties, but it's not really part of the story. If the person is a soldier in like Call of Duty or like Halo or some other movie or something like that, and they're actually like in the military the whole time, or they come the military experience takes up like half the film, book, movie, whatever.
yeah. And also I would another one, like in terms of a game, if we're talking about those, another one that I just remembered, I thought of before, but I kind of forgot about, because I don't really play it much, is like Gears of War. That is one that I would definitely stick in the military fiction genre.
Yeah.
Again, definitely
me too.
the science fiction side of that as well. But yeah, because it's a lot of going and guns blazing, kill all the things.
Yeah.
These two big warring factions.
See, but I can think of other games that fall into those descriptions but aren't military.
Okay.
Pray tell.
What?
The one that comes to mind immediately is Left 4 Dead.
Left 4 Dead? Yeah,
You're
again,
a squad,
I mean,
there's no puzzles, you're just running around shooting zombies.
But that's
You're
Yeah.
just
more
like
of a survival.
average people.
That's more of a survival thing.
It is.
Than just you're in the military. I mean, there is Call of Duty.
No, I'm not saying
zombies
it's military fiction. I'm just saying
and
like
you're like
all
a
the things
group
you're
of
using to
forces.
describe military fiction are there, except they're not in the military, and you're fighting zombies instead of people.
Yeah, and I mean, I see that, and
Mhm.
I would. That's another one I would almost consider, I guess, or I could find
Like
points.
if you had that exact game, but you put all of the characters you're playing in uniform, you'd be like, yeah, that's a military game.
Not
Or
necessarily,
were they sit?
just
Well,
because
they would have to be.
it seems, again, as Josh said, it seems more survival based, and instead of fighting, because it doesn't really feel like it's not tactical,
Yeah.
largely. Like
Yeah.
the zombies aren't really tactically fighting; they're just kind of trying to eat.
Okay.
Yeah, they're just taking over. They're just like they're the ones in charge, and you're just trying to survive. And or if you were a military, it was a military squad that was sent there by the lieutenant, and they had to fight their way to an LZ or secure this person or thing, and they they kind of had maybe they had some fighting about who was in charge or why they were doing this, yada yada. That would be more of a military type thing.
Yeah,
Gotcha.
and sorry, when you said that, it also kind of made me think maybe Suicide Squad is kind of military-ish, and I can almost see it with a lot of that. But again, that's another one of those kind of a.
Why?
Another-
That's my burning question. Why?
It's another one of those kind of sub-genres, though. Again, because they are kind of military-based, especially like Rick Flag.
No.
And they're a branch of the government. They're a private group.
I feel like we need to make some Venn diagrams or something.
Yeah, probably.
Yeah.
Anyways,
we're bringing charts next time, everyone.
These are military, these aren't, but they like sort of overlap a little bit.
No.
But and then so we're talking a lot about games because it seems like most of us we all have probably most of our experience in military fiction with video games.
I kind of wanted to invite my grandmother to this actually,
Okay.
because she's been listening to a ton of historical fiction audiobooks recently, and every time we talk, she's always telling me about like you learn so much about when it's what it's like to be in the trenches and like what happened during this battle and whatever. And she's like, I've learned so much about history. And so I just think about her anytime I think of like military fiction. I think about I'll have to like figure out who the author she's listening to is, because she's like, you gotta listen to his stuff. He writes so many stories. I'm like, okay, Grandma.
Alright.
So there's apparently a lot of military fiction books out there, but that's not generally what I read. So I don't know.
Yeah, and I was gonna say I've looked it up too. I didn't really have to, because I know when I go to like a bookstore or something, that's where I tend to see a lot of military fiction stuff.
Mhm.
Again, probably the one that I'm most familiar with, at least in name, is Tom Clancy. But I know there's a lot of other people that do that too. And I always wanted to say as well that films are really high up there with military fiction, but then I started going through a list and just trying to think of movies that I'm familiar with that might that, and it's a lot sparser than I initially was thinking.
I feel like I can think of a couple, and if we're not just talking about historical fiction, because there was that one recently, meaning like within the last 2 years.
1917?
No.
Well, there was 1917.
There was one about
there was
D-Day,
Dunkirk.
Dunkirk,
and
those
that's what it was.
Which Dunkirk was fantastic.
I
And then
wanted
there was
to see it, I
another
never saw it.
one. Wasn't there another
Yeah.
one like last year or something? I remember thinking it
remember.
alongside 1917. It felt very similar to me. I was
It
thinking.
does seem like they come out periodically.
But those are just military movies, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's not. Yeah.
Well, I mean,
and they're
it's that whole like based on a true story.
Yeah,
thing.
and that's what I was gonna say, and that's kind of why I was iffy about. I've been kind of iffy about considering Apocalypse Now, because it's definitely military based, and like the setting is very real, but this exact story I'm pretty sure is fiction. It's made up. It's a great movie. It's really long. It feels really long. Because it's definitely pretty slow, but it's good. If you haven't seen it, maybe give it a try. It's not for everyone, but
well, we're all and most of everyone is self-quarantining and watching a lot of stuff. So yeah, if you want to kill how many hours?
Got nothing better to do.
It's like 2.5 hours, which
I mean
really isn't that long, I guess. But this one Apocalypse Now feels really long.
Yeah, it's like watching Endgame, but probably less than you're probably less invested.
Yeah, and it doesn't move as quickly as I've said.
So, in typical Hannah fashion, I did some Googling just now.
Naturally.
And I found. Did either of you mention Predator?
Yeah. I mentioned it when we were talking before this.
Okay. Because I just found like a top 10, and it's funny because a lot of these are things I was thinking about or we said. So like number 1 is Predator. Number 3 is The Edge of Tomorrow. Did either of you guys see that?
Yeah,
one?
I liked Edge of Tomorrow.
And that was definitely one
that
I was thinking about.
I also would consider one that I remember seeing when I looked this up yesterday as well. Was Ender's Game.
I feel like I should have seen that, but I don't think I have.
I like it.
I wouldn't immediately consider that military,
but I mean, like it kind of is, because again, it's sci-fi, and they're training for like the military, their version of the military at that point, and they're doing all these battles. A lot of it's simulations, and later in some of the other books, you start getting into that, like the bigger war and everything. But and
they have. Sorry. They have the Stargate movie on this list. Another one I was thinking of was Independence Day.
Yes.
Yeah.
And the second one.
And they have Suicide Squad on here.
God, why?
Again, I see it like because it is more militaristic.
It's like 5-10% military.
So the one that that came up that I thought was really interesting is Captain America: The First Avenger.
See that? Yeah, I can get behind that.
That one makes sense.
Which is not something that like I had in like the section on my brain that's like, oh yeah, military like things, but it's
because you think of it as a superhero movie first. You don't think of the military part.
And actually, but no, the whole thing is about the military.
That's also
World War II, but it's fictional.
That's also kind of along the lines of where I want to go with like Punisher.
Yeah,
again,
that's
and
kind of an offset. Yeah, but
it is
I
a
would
bit.
consider that
It's
more than
definitely
Suicide Squad.
yeah, it's definitely different than like Captain America: The First Avenger. But
Oh yeah.
again, like he's a soldier. He was a soldier,
Hmm.
and that's a whole thing. And he himself has more of the military um, vibe or history background and everything presence, I guess. Um, he's more of a one-man army, I suppose. So we say, I'm sorry, are you still?
No, I was just gonna say I found a different list, and I want to know your thoughts. This one has
I also saw Master and Commander.
Star Wars episodes 4 through 6.
See, I would consider 1 through 3 more in line with that than
Really?
yeah,
I think so.
because well, actually, more than any of the movies, I would consider the Clone Wars
Well, sure, yeah,
series that
that
because
makes
that's
sense.
actually
Yeah.
with the war and everything.
Yeah, I guess.
One, I I would almost
No.
consider one political fiction more than military fiction, which
Yeah.
I would say is a pretty big distinction.
From the
'Cause, I
end of
mean,
episode 2 to Clone Wars to the like start of episode 3, it's military
actually
fiction.
most of episode 3, I believe.
A good chunk of it.
Yeah, because up until they kill Grievous, it's pretty much focusing on the war.
Trying to end the war.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Not surprising though.
yeah, so what about games? I know we went through a few of these, but there were some others. Again, Tom Clancy, that's more of the name now associated with a lot of Ubisoft games. They're not really based on the books, I don't think. But many of those, at least, are definitely military fiction. Some of them, like I've been playing The Division a lot lately. That's still kind of a, I don't know. It's actually very fitting for right now because it's like a pandemic has broken out and is basically crumbled society, and everybody's going out and trying to, you're playing as this character who's trying to fix it all. But yeah, there's that, and of course, Ghost Recon I would definitely say is military.
What year did that come out?
Ghost Recon.
Yeah.
The first one was like 2003 or something, I think.
I know I played a Ghost
maybe
Recon
2002.
back in like 2012, 2013.
I just thought of something.
Maybe. And then there's the newer ones. There was Wildlands, and most recently last year's Breakpoint,
Gotcha.
which are a bit different, but some of the earlier ones are definitely more military fiction.
I'm not.
Sorry.
So I was just gonna say I don't know if I know a whole lot of like military fiction games.
There's probably more that you know that you wouldn't think of.
Maybe.
Yeah.
Well, most of the ones you've said, like sort of the big ones, I'm familiar with and like have played or heard of. So like, Halo and Call of Duty and stuff like that, I'm pretty familiar with. But I can't think of much else.
So one that is a bit different of a take. Specifically, I would consider Assassin's Creed 3 military fiction because it's the American Revolution, and a lot of what you do in that game is going after like military people, military leaders, fighting armies, but they're Templars and stuff. So you have your Assassin's Creed
right
reasons going on. There's also like, again, another one that's probably a bit weird. I would consider like Age of Empires. Because
well,
again,
if Age of Empires is military, then so is Civilization.
Yeah.
And Red Alert.
I would kind of say that too.
Red
I'm
Alert
not too familiar with that, but yeah.
Are you familiar with Red Alert?
I think I've heard of it. I've not.
Red Alert. It plays very similarly to Age of Empires, actually, but it's like kind of in the future, and the sort of typical scenario is you're the Americans and you're fighting like the USSR or the Russians or whatever, and yeah. And it's a fun time, but it's definitely just the whole thing is military. And like military in the traditional sense, because I feel like Age of Empires is more, it is militaristic, but in sort of that, you know, old-fashioned fantasy kind of way where it's like we have knights and cavalry and blah blah blah. But Red Alert is very much like you're making a tank.
Yeah. And then this is where you can start opening up to a lot of different things based on your own interpretation of what that genre is. So like StarCraft, I would actually say almost without question is military. But then like Warcraft, if you want to consider those, since those are RTSs, the first three at least, and you're commanding, like you're building commanding armies largely to do things. But that's where it mixes more with fantasy a lot. Same with like StarCraft, that's mixing with science fiction again. And I guess to me that means, so I do kind of have limited experience with RTS games, but I would almost want to just group them in and say those are generally going to be military fiction.
RTS meaning?
Real-time strategy. So
gotcha.
like Age of Empires, Civilization, Warcraft, StarCraft.
My question in terms of like transitioning to talking about fantasy is like, what do you define as a military in fantasy? Because like if, depending on how you stretch the definition, anything about like King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table could be military.
Yeah.
Like those are the warriors at the time.
Historical fiction / military fiction, that King Arthur, anything going back to like 300 or Braveheart.
Yeah, and then if you want to just consider it warfare or war fiction or something, and if that is the same as military fiction, if not, then military fiction could be, you could narrow that down to more modern.
Yeah, I feel like you could maybe have the bigger umbrella of like warfare or war fiction, or maybe just even call it like, I don't know, maybe you put it under the even larger umbrella of just like action.
Action. They go action movies when it comes down to it.
And you have like the more militaristic stuff and the more like, you know, the James Bond, adventure-y, Indiana Jones, like kind of where does that stuff all fit in?
Yeah.
I thought of a really interesting one that I'm really ashamed I didn't think of earlier, that is technically military fiction but is so different, is MASH.
Yeah, I thought of MASH earlier too.
You're like, technically that's military, but it's a completely different take on it because it's the doctors and it's funny but it's dramatic and all this stuff, but there's like hardly ever any gunfire.
I was also going to say the same about Stripes earlier, which apparently
I don't know.
Josh, did you say you're familiar with Stripes?
Can't say that I am, no.
It's a Bill Murray movie, really good. It's been a long time since I've seen it, so I don't remember much. But yeah, again, it's definitely comedy, but still in line with technically military fiction. There was another one I was thinking of the other day when I was making my list, but I forgot.
Apparently didn't make a very good list.
Apparently I did not.
Yeah, don't forget Transformers is military fiction.
Yeah. If you've played like War for Cybertron and what's the other one?
Oh. Well, I was thinking, I guess it works for both sides.
That works more.
Cybertron, and then like because they're the Autobots and the Decepticons are fighting, and then you have in the movies where the humans are helping the Autobots, maybe helping the Decepticons.
What about Lord of the Rings?
Yeah, again, that's one that I would still.
Maybe not military fiction, but definitely.
Yeah, if we want to consider it like warfare.
Yeah.
Fiction. Yeah.
Well, and then even more so.
Even though, again, with that, I probably wouldn't put the first one in there.
No, I would
It's been the longest time since I've seen the second and third, but I remember the third.
I'm definitely thinking mostly about the third. Yeah.
But
I feel like.
I don't remember much about the second one.
But I feel like it's interesting because
it was mainly to just the battle at Helm's Deep as being the big military battle that they had to fight.
Yeah, but I think it's definitely like more militaristic than something like King Arthur, because like you have these huge team. What's the word I'm looking for? Team. That's not the right word.
Huge
Army.
factions.
That's the word. Army. Huge
Armies,
armies, and they have leaders, and they have different people doing different things in them, and so it seems very, very similar to me, actually, except that the time frame's different.
Yeah. So we've talked some about like how it mixes with science fiction, some with fantasy. What about like horror?
Ooh.
Again, I was trying to make the point earlier to you guys that Aliens, the second movie, the one to follow Alien, I would kind of make a point that could be military fiction, just because I know the colonial Marines have a larger presence there, and it's more action oriented, and there's a lot more open conflict.
I'm not super familiar with this, so correct me if I'm wrong, but what about something like, oh my gosh, I'm gonna be so embarrassed if I'm like totally off base here. What about something like the X-Files? Is that like a military sort of thing?
Not that I recall at all.
I'm not like barely even familiar
they're like
with it.
FBI or something, right?
Okay, it's more of like an FBI police thing.
Yeah, it's
okay. I couldn't remember.
It's been a long time since I've seen it.
I know
really
barely anything about it, so apologies.
Yeah. Yeah, and then there are other things. Again, I guess that's, well, never mind. I'm starting to get in again to more like espionage type things, which actually we were talking about horror. So, Josh, can you think of anything with horror mixing with military?
Only the slight bit you have in like Halo, I guess some military games where there's a horror element added into it. That's kind of
what I was going to say.
Having trouble thinking of one of like where the military has to go in because there's this zombie outbreak or this pandemic that turns people into monsters, something like that.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's usually sitting them into a situation where there is something that's going to kill them, and there's usually like they're a strike team that get picked off one by one.
I think one of the biggest things that kind of we as a group have learned in the nearly year of doing this is like there's so much overlap when it comes to these genres that I feel like even if I can't think of like horror military things specifically, you can definitely think of military things that had horror elements, or like especially in terms of like a TV show. So again, I'm thinking back to Stargate. You might have just like a horror episode.
Yeah.
Right, where you just have one episode where you're fighting this particular monster or enemy and they're really scary, or there might be more of like you can almost call it more of like a body horror sort of thing, depending on like how gruesome and realistic this military stuff is going to be, right? Yeah. So but I don't know how much like traditional, horror you're going to get in a mashup there.
Yeah. Well, one that it's another one that's you could kind of make a point for, and I'm gonna, is the game series Fear. It stands for First Encounter Assault Recon. No doubt they just really wanted to make something that spelled out fear. Which is, I don't know how familiar either of you are with that, but it's interesting. Like it's horror first and foremost. But you're going in there, it's a shooter. It's a first-person shooter, and you're fighting like basically this small army. Maybe it's a big army, but you just, you fight it in a reasonable amount of enemies at a time. So and your guy is kind of military-ish, and sometimes you like go in with a team, but basically it's focused on your character. And it has a bit more of a military kind of vibe to it, in my opinion. So that's probably my first thought, or maybe not first thought, obviously, since it took me a second. But it's one that I can think of with horror crossing with military fiction.
Yeah, it's one of those more military fiction usually goes kind of hand in hand with like fantasy or science fiction or historical fiction.
Yes, I think sci-fi and history are like the two most obvious ways for it to go.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And if you haven't played Fear, I would recommend it because it's a 15-year-old game now, so it's not a big download. and you could probably get it pretty cheap. But yeah, so do we think, we've kind of talked about this a good bit already, do we think there's a better name for this genre? Or do we think this is more of a subgenre?
I think that maybe we could rename the like overarching genre to be something like, I don't know, war fiction or battle fiction or something like that.
Yeah, I hate to call it
But
just
it's still,
action
yeah.
Yeah.
because you have
Action
like
still seems way more broad.
yeah,
'Cause
because you could have a military. You could put military fiction for certain films, movies, games.
Yeah. Well, I think that it all fits under the action umbrella, but like, or most of it does, but I feel like that's just too general for us to say like, yeah, that's what this is. It's action. And we need something a little bit more specific. But I feel like my other issue is you have so many different variations, like in terms of military fiction, if you want to call it that. You also have stuff like MASH, which is very much not about the same things as Call of Duty. And you also have Stargate, which is more about exploration and discovery and adventure than just strictly the military, but it's all very much tied into the military. So I feel like you might need a couple different groups, but I don't know what to call the group that they're all underneath.
So are we thinking right now we
should
just stick to military fiction?
And
we should just stick to that until we come up with something better?
You can call, military fictions or military nonfiction. I'm sure there's a better word for that, or just military story, Just to have both of those kind of talk about the same thing, where one talks about fictional movies and events, whatever, to another one where it's like, okay, this is a movie about World War II, World War One, Civil War / the Battle of whatever, some historical battle.
How about fiction that involves people in uniforms but not policemen and could take place in the present or the past or the future?
That's a really big name for a genre.
And they're not mercenaries either.
No, or spies. That's different.
Yeah. Or assassins.
So,
right. But maybe they could be.
Well, they could be like Assassin's Creed 3.
You could have assassins, military.
Sometimes they're doctors, but it's not like a hospital thing. But it also kind of is sometimes.
Right.
So, kind of last little question: who does this genre appeal to? Does it appeal to anybody? Does it appeal more to people who have served in the military, who are active, or?
I think it depends, because there's so many different types. There's going to be something for everyone, right? So even if you're not into, you don't want to go see Dunkirk because it's, a really sort of gritty, realistic war movie. Maybe you want to go see it. I want to see it. Maybe you should want to go see something about King Arthur or Transformers or Stargate or MASH, and like they're all so different.
There are a lot of
there's something for everyone.
Things that can appeal to a lot of people.
It reels in people that definitely have a military experience and like military. They're watching a movie with someone and watching a movie that didn't plan to go see themselves, but military's in here. Okay, that's cool. I can get along with this. This is cool. Even though there's probably a lot of things that get wrong about what happens in the military, or how they like, how much homework do they do about military factions and their chain of command and how combat works.
Yeah, and if anyone can find any military romance, that'd be cool too. Let us know.
Yeah, so that's all, I think, really good stuff. We covered a lot of our bases, I think, talked about what can be included in military fiction, kind of some examples of what's there, kind of branched out a little bit.
We just always come back to this conversation about where are the lines between genres. We don't know.
We like blurring the lines between everything.
Yeah.
And destroying.
We'll draw a line, then someone comes behind us with a marker, just makes the line. We'll adds a line, and then someone tries to erase both lines. Then we just throw paint on it and draw more lines.
Exactly.
Yep.
So, what do we have for next week, Hannah? I believe that is you, right?
Me. Next week, we're gonna be talking about anime. I want to know what anime you've seen, what you liked about them, what you didn't like about them. I don't think either of you have watched a ton.
I feel like Josh has.
I haven't watched. I can't say a ton, but I have been watching a good bit.
Well, why don't you watch more? These are the questions I want to answer.
I'm more a cartoon.
No, I don't want to hear it right now. This for next week. Next week.
Okay.
Next time.
This is going to be a poor subject for me probably, but Hannah and Josh, I trust you two to carry it.
We'll interrogate
Cool.
you of your lack of experience with
Yeah.
anime.
What's wrong?
Because
We
I'm very
always do
surprised.
already.
I'm very surprised that you don't with your Dragon Ball
Okay,
history.
next week.
That should be, yeah, that's a conversation for next week. So,
Next week.
Okay, all right.
thank you all for joining us. I hope you enjoyed. Hope it gave you something to think about. Or if you disagree with us on everything, come find us after the quarantine and yell at us. Yell at us right into our faces.
Yeah.
Or you can yell at us on social media, and we'll just we'll probably yell back. It'll probably be Hannah or Josh, depending on where you're doing it.
Yep.
Possibly.
Stay home. Wash your hands.
Yeah.
Yes. That's the real threat there that we should be fighting. Germs.
Yeah. We're all at war right now.
Yes.
Yeah.
All right.
But to
anyways,
those military people, we salute you for your service.
yes, we do. And right now we salute our I just blanked on the name.
Doctors, nurses,
Doctors?
No,
emergency care people.
The mandatory, the good people, the whatever the name for those workers are. I'm sorry.
People who are still out in the world doing good work.
Doing jobs. Yes.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining, and we hope to see you next time. Until then, nerd out.
Farewell.